I should use that song as my ringtone. How do we measure happiness? Why are some people happier than others? And how do we improve quality of life? Those are the three questions that I've dedicated my career to. It's the three questions we try to solve at the Happiness Research Institute in Copenhagen. And it's also the three questions I'll be shedding some light on for you guys. Just a couple of things I should mention. As most of you, English is not my first language. And I've noticed when I speak English instead of Danish, I concentrate, and therefore I get a really grumpy look on my face, which is a bad thing when you're a happiness researcher. But I'm really pleased to be back in Vilnius. I should also mention that when you work with happiness and happiness research, a lot of people imagine that our office looks somewhat like this, and we have a room full of ice cream and a room full of puppies. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It looks more like this. So we look at a lot of numbers, we look at a lot of statistics, and we look at evidence. So we're essentially trying to have a scientific approach to understanding well-being and quality of life. So one of the core questions, as mentioned, is how we measure happiness, but I'd actually like to give you an overview of what's going on globally with happiness and politics, because it is emerging as the new measure of progress. So back in 2011, the United Nations passed a resolution on happiness, calling for all countries of the world to focus more on well-being and see what they can do to improve quality of life for citizens. So we also have different governments that are embracing these softer measures and asking not only are we getting richer, but equally important, are we getting happier as people? And how many of you have heard of the small country called Bhutan? Quite a few, very good. So for those of you that haven't, Bhutan, even smaller than Denmark and Lithuania, 700,000 people in the eastern Himalayas. But from a happiness point of view, what is interesting about Bhutan is that they, since the beginning of the 70s, have used something they call gross national happiness. So instead of focusing on the gross national product, are we getting richer? Every political decision is based on, is this going to improve quality of life for our citizens? And it's Bhutan that have inspired the UN to look at these measures. So we also have some of the richest countries in the world looking at these happiness metrics. So this is in the United Arab Emirates. The lady on the right is the Minister of State for Happiness and Well-being. And her KPI, her ambition, her task is to get the UAE to the top 5 in the World Happiness Report by 2021. So I think it's interesting that it's actually the 7th richest country in the world. They also have the tallest building in the world. Now they want to be one of the happiest. And it's because increasingly politicians are recognizing that we need these softer metrics that can capture how people are actually feeling. And that brings us to the key question that brings me a lot of gray hair, namely, how do we measure something as intangible and subjective as well-being? Well, whether we look at quality of life, well-being, happiness, or flourishing, the key challenge is that those are really wide terms. So you have one idea of what happiness is, I might have another one. So what we do when we meet these complex, wide umbrella terms is we break them down and we look at the different components. It's also what you guys do when you look at the Lithuanian economy. You also break that down and look at how's the growth, how's the GDP per capita, what's the unemployment rate, and so on. And that gives us a language to talk about how is the economy doing. So that's also what we need to do with well-being and happiness. And essentially, we look at 3 different perspectives of happiness. First, we look at an overall life satisfaction. And here we will ask participants to essentially take a step back and evaluate their lives. We will ask them directly, so considering the worst possible life you could live and the best possible life you could live on a scale from 0 to 10, where do you feel you stand right now? That's a very stable answer gives us. We see that people answer the same today as they did 2 weeks ago. A second dimension is called the affective dimension. And here we ask how people are feeling right now or yesterday, a specific point in time. And we ask them on a spectrum of emotions, so both positive and negative emotions. We ask them about happiness, but also sadness, loneliness, stress, anxiety, and so on. And there we can see there is a lot of volatility. How happy people are right now depends on whether it's a Friday or whether it's a Monday. When we follow people over time, we can also see what day of the year are the happiest. And usually we see, for example, Christmas Day is one of the happiest days. In 2016, we saw that one of the unhappiest days in the UK was November 9th, because that was the day we woke up and Donald Trump was elected president. So we can see the impact of political events in the happiness data when it comes to the affective dimension. Now, the third dimension is called the eudaimonic dimension. And that's just the ancient Greek word for happiness. So that refers to what Aristotle thought the good life was, and to him the good life was the meaningful life. So here we're looking at whether people have a sense of purpose. And for instance, having kids have a positive impact on that. Kids have mixed results on some of the other dimensions of well-being. So what we like to do also is we like to follow people over time. So we could follow you and 10,000 people from Vilnius over the next 10 years to see how changes in your life circumstance impact these different dimensions. Because if we just looked at a specific point of time, we could, for instance, say that, okay, people who are married are, on average, more satisfied with life. But is that because we become happier when we get married, or is there a tendency for happy people to get married? Do you understand the cause and effect issue? So when we follow people over time, we find this pattern. So marriage happens in the year 0. But even before, we can see there's an increase in happiness leading up to marriage. So women are red, men are blue. So a couple of years before, you meet that certain someone, maybe at a business conference, and you find out how much you have in common. You like business, I like business, let's get married. And then you get married, and then you can see we sort of adapt to marriage, and the happiness levels goes a little down. But we can see that actually both things are true. There is a significant lasting effect of marriage on happiness. But when we look back in the data, we can also see that those people that were happier in the beginning of the study had a bigger chance of getting married in the following decade. So, when we look at life satisfaction, what we often find is that the Scandinavian countries often do well in the happiness rankings. And now I'm trying to shift the slide. There we are. So these are the past 7 World Happiness Reports. There's 155 countries in the World Happiness Report. They are based on life satisfaction. Around 3,000 people in each country are asked, and then you calculate a national average. And that's very important to underline. So these countries have the highest averages in the world, so you can call them the happiest countries in the world, or you can turn it around and say perhaps they're the least unhappy countries. But the Nordic countries do quite well. Switzerland, the Netherlands, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So show of hands, which of the 3 Baltic countries do you think is in the top of the, or leading in the World Happiness Report? Sorry, calm down. How many of you think it's Estonia? How many of you think it's Latvia? Okay. Okay, a third of you thought Estonia. 1 person thought Latvia. And how about Lithuania? I'd say 2/3. That's correct. So Lithuania is in 42nd place, and the other two are 53rd and 55th place. So when we look at the relationship between different factors and why some countries are happier than others, we can see that a few factors impact and explain the difference in happiness levels. One of them is GDP per capita and happiness. So the green line indicates the average relationship between GDP per capita and well-being. And the overall picture here is the richer the countries, the happier the country. But as you can see, there is a lot of difference. So a country might, or two countries might have the same GDP levels, but have different possibilities in converting that wealth into well-being. So the countries we want to look out for are countries that are above the green line. The Nordic countries are above the green line. Lithuania is above the green line. And that means you are relatively good at taking the wealth that you have and converting that into quality of life. So that's great. When we look at the relationship between GDP per capita and happiness for the three Baltic countries, we see this development in Lithuania. So there was a big drop in life satisfaction between 2006 and 2007. But since then, the life satisfaction has followed very consistently the progression in the GDP per capita. There's a bit of a different picture, or sort of a similar picture in Estonia. There we also see a similar development between GDP per capita and life satisfaction. And here we have Latvia. The interesting part is, for the past 5 years, there's been an increase in GDP per capita in Latvia without that being converted into well-being. So that's something to look out for. But when we look at the average relationship at the individual level, so when we look at the individual people, what is the relationship between wealth and happiness? We see this picture. So high income is out to the right, and happiness is upwards. And there you'll see, again, on average, richer people are happier. But it's very important to underline that what seems to be at play is being without money is a cause of unhappiness. Going from low income to middle income has a big marginal impact on happiness, but going from middle income to high income, yes, there's a little bit of an impact, but not as much as going from low income to middle income. So with money, as with everything else, we see diminishing marginal returns. So the more we have of something, the less marginal utility we get out of it. Another issue with GDP and well-being is sometimes we see countries getting richer without getting happier. And that has to do with that people often care about the position in the social hierarchy. So people will care often more about the relative income than the absolute income. So put in blunt terms, you're very happy to drive your BMW, but then suddenly the neighbor drives up in a Ferrari, and then suddenly the BMW is not so good anymore. So when we get richer, if everybody just doubles their income, we're still stuck in the same place in the social hierarchy. So that's why we sometimes see countries getting richer without getting happier. So as a country, it's very important to invest in the right places. One of the reasons why Scandinavia and the Nordic countries often do well is high levels of social security, generous unemployment benefits, access to healthcare, access to university education. It's also why we love taxes. So in Denmark, we pay around 50% of our income in tax. Now, some of you are looking a little bit scared. But actually, 9 out of 10 Danes say they are happily to pay their tax, because Danes see taxes as a collective investment in quality of life. Another factor that explains the difference in happiness levels between countries is trust levels. So do we trust the government? Do we trust companies? Do we trust our neighbors? And one of the ways you can measure trust is asking people directly, do you feel that most people can be trusted? Or can't you become too careful when it comes to strangers? In the Nordic countries, you'll see some of the highest trust levels. The only Baltic country we have up here is Estonia, but that's actually quite high up. So that's a very positive thing. I would expect the same level in Lithuania. So another way to sort of measure trust is to go around in cities and look for manifestations of trust. So these are pictures from Copenhagen, where people have a tendency to leave their kids outside when they're inside having a cup of coffee. To me, that's one of the greatest manifestations of trust. But you can also go around in cities and throw wallets on the street. So scientists have done this in 20 cities around the world, taking a wallet with cash, about a day's worth of pay, and some business cards or other ways to ID that person. And you drop the wallets on the street, and then you see how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. Okay? So if we drop 100 wallets around the world, how many wallets do you think will be returned with the cash intact? 10%? 20%? 30%? 5%? 0%? Okay. The answer is actually 50%. Around 50% of the wallets in the latest study was returned with the money intact. The highest score was Helsinki. 92% of the wallets were returned with the money intact. Is this surprising? So in a lot of countries, this is actually surprising. People expect that a lower number of wallets are returned that is, in fact, actually returned. So another reason why we see some countries happier than others is the freedom they have in general sense, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so on, but also what freedom they have over their time. And in the Nordic countries, you'll have quite good balance between work and life. People are able to have an interesting career, but at the same time maintain an interesting family life. And that's also why this phenomenon, hygge, is a big thing in Denmark. Short definition of hygge is the art of creating a nice atmosphere. It's these moments where we experience togetherness, relaxation, perhaps savoring some simple treats. And now my point is that that's not something that Denmark has a monopoly on. That's something that happens just as much here in Vilnius as it does in Copenhagen. But what is uniquely Danish is that we have a word that describes that situation. So I have 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to cover what companies can do if they're interested in well-being and happiness. So what we've done in Copenhagen is partner up with a firm that has 200 employees and turn that company into a happiness lab. So we try out different interventions. We measure the employees over time and see how different interventions impact quality of life and happiness for the employees. So we've run the experiment now for 6 months, and considering from the beginning of the study to the last survey, we've been able to improve happiness for 34% of the employees, but 28% are less happy than we started, and we have 38% who are at the same level. But just as a tip, if you are interested in moving into well-being and measuring that among your employees, do it. I think it's one of the most interesting things we can do as companies to take care of our employees, see what actually impacts not just their job satisfaction, but their life satisfaction. And we do have good, robust measures that are able to capture these different dimensions of well-being. Remember, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So that would be my advice to you. Start measuring well-being, see what you can do, try out different interventions, and see what can lift life satisfaction. And then hopefully we can bring Lithuania even further up in the Global Happiness Report. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.